Hello, everyone, and thank you, Kimberly, for the introduction and for keeping everyone entertained while we were getting ready. So my name's Tom. I'm the Customer Success Manager at ROEST, and we are super excited to be joined today by Scott Rao.
Happy to be here.
So Scott, I'm sure if you're on this call, you already know fully well who Scott is, but in case you don't, Scott is probably the world's most influential roasting consultant and all-round coffee educator. He has a roastery in the US called Prodigal, where they roast like really incredible and pretty rare coffees. We were drinking a beautiful natural geisha this morning. Scott does drink natural sometimes. And he's also he's been a supporter of Roast for a long time, and he's also in the last year or two also became an investor. So we're really happy to have Scott as a partner for the business, and we are really excited to have him here with us in Oslo. So the format for today, it's a Q&A. We have some questions already sent in by people, so I've tried to distill those down as much as possible so that I'm covering the questions that people have already asked. But if you have more questions, as Kimberly said, do drop them in the chat, and we will try and leave some time at the end to address those as well. We won't be able to answer everyone's questions, so apologies in advance if we don't get to you, but we will do our absolute best. But before that, I'm just going to hand up to Scott to give a bit of an introduction to how he approaches using the Roast as a tool in his own roasting.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everybody. So we use two of the roast machines at Prodigal. I chose it because if you've been in coffee for a while, you might remember the days of the open barrel sample roasters with the probe stuck in the air somewhere and the big trier. And sample roasting historically has been a little bit of a crapshoot, a very tricky thing to collect really good data on and to have be consistent or automated. And I was really happy when I first encountered the Roast that it was collecting a lot of data. And after some discussions with them, once they implemented the potential to add a between batch protocol recipe that you could create yourself, I was super happy because you can just roast with incredible consistency and predictability in the roast. So, which is really what we want in our sample roaster. We roast about 30 or 40 samples a week. Sometimes we repeat a sample roast, so we're probably doing about 50 batches per week. And obviously, it's very time-consuming and tedious if you have to make lots of micro manual adjustments on a sample roaster for all those 50 batches. But instead, we feel quite confident when we press the button and let the machine handle almost all of the work and the decisions. We feel quite confident that the outcome is going to be what we want. We tend to use the machine one of two ways. If we're doing 100-gram batches or 50-gram batches, we will usually use the inlet temperature versus time recipe. And if we're doing 200-gram batches, like let's say I'm doing a class and I just need some small samples for the class, we'll use the inlet temperature, bean temperature. Now, the reason we favor inlet temperature is that the machine will make sure that the air temperature coming into the roasting chamber is exactly what you programmed it to be, regardless of the ambient conditions. So whether it's cold or warm in the roastery, what happens inside the machine will not change. So that's a beautiful thing. So whether you come in the morning and it's cold or you're roasting in the afternoon, it's warm, doesn't really matter very much. You'll get the same result within the machine. The reason we switch from IT time for small batches versus ITBT for larger batches is simply that the bean temperature data quality is more reliable at the larger batch size. So with the less reliable, smaller batches, using a good between batch protocol that sets you up to always start with the same thermal energy at the beginning of a roast and running at an IT time, everything is pretty predictable. Whereas when we get to the larger batches, we can rely on bean temperature set points to guide those inlet temperatures.
Yeah. Great. And it's an interesting point that you made that it's to do with feedback from you that we introduced this BTIT profile from you and other users. And I guess this is one of the points is that we're always adapting what we're doing. We're always looking to improve the roaster. We're never thinking it's finished. And it's people like Scott and like you guys coming to us, telling us what you want from the roaster has actually really driven the development of this machine. So that's why it's like so packed with these kind of features. Some of them that everyone uses, some of them that only a few people actually have a need for. But yeah, we really do value that kind of feedback.
I've interacted with a lot of machine manufacturers throughout my career over 30-something years, and I ended up wanting to work with ROEST because those conversations actually led to action. So when Trond and Veronica came to one of my classes, we talked afterward, and that class really, drove home the importance of between batch protocol. And I loved that immediately Trond was like, you know what, that's really important. We can program that, and we can customize that. And that got me so excited because I've walked up to many manufacturers, talked about between batch protocol in the past, and they kind of shrugged. And it's really nice to work with people who are really keen to hear what experienced users want, and then figure out a way to implement it. And it was actually implemented within a week, which is another very good sign, right? So
don't want to say rushed out, but
no, but
we move fast.
That's awesome. Yeah, that says a lot.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So yeah, keep those ideas coming, and you guys as well. But yeah, so the first question I really wanted to ask is really, before we kind of answer any questions about roasting on this sample roaster, but what a lot of people ask is what you say in your books all still 100% correct and valid enough?
100% certainly not. I mean, I'm never right 100%. No one's ever right 100%. My thoughts evolve, my ideas, experience evolves. When it comes to sample roasting, there's a lot of things I'm a little less concerned about than in production roasting, because almost every sample roast we do is the first time we've ever seen a coffee. So in a production roaster, what we're trying to do is say, how do we optimize a coffee? And then how do we replicate that profile 100 times or however many times? In a sample roaster, that's not actually the goal. The goal is, how do I make sure that I don't screw up this coffee because I only have 1 or 2 tries at it? Yeah. So, which might sound a little funny, but it's the truth, is that if I get some samples from a farmer, a supplier of some kind, and I only have 1 or 2 tries, I need to figure out a safe way to bring this coffee to the color range I want in a competent way, so that I can give this sample the best chance of showing itself well. And so this might surprise you, but this will actually definitely surprise people. But when we do 100-gram batches, we always use the same profile to start, regardless of the coffee. And the reason we do this is twofold. One is that we've tried to find a profile approach that generally works. Well, I would say, okay, if you had something like a mocha bean, like one of these super tiny beans, okay, maybe we would adjust a little bit for that, but that's quite the outlier. And the second reason we do that is that we want to have a sense of how this coffee is going to behave in our IMF production roaster. And we do a system where if this coffee, let's say our coffees, wash coffees, take 8 minutes, 30 seconds on average in the roast with this profile. One coffee might take 8:35, another coffee might take 8:25, okay? Now, that 8:35 coffee, when we put it in the IMF, might take 8 minutes, let's just say, okay? The fact that coffee number 2 took 10 seconds less in the roast with the same profile means we can walk up to the IMF, we can use coffee number 1's profile in the IMF, and we can actually shave 10 seconds off of it and be within plus or minus 2 seconds of our target time, and effectively within 1 point of the color that we want on that coffee. So
just one roast.
After just one roast, yes. So because the roast and the IMF have a similar approach in terms of inlet temperature, because the between batch protocols, et cetera, are creating a predictable environment for the coffee, we are able to effectively guess the roast time, and or you could look at it as development time if you feel confident in your first crack marks, for the production roasts is just off of 1 sample roast. Although, to tell you the truth, when we get the arrival coffee, we tend to do 5 or 6 sample roasts, tend to make sure we're being very precise, and then we're very confident about what we're going to do in a production roaster. So it's not about transferring exact times. It's not about transferring temperatures. It's more about an analog, like saying, if this happened relative to other sample roasts, it's going to do this in a production roaster relative to other production roasts.
Yeah. So you mentioned roast time. Are there any other things that you're looking out for in how a coffee behaves that you then use to translate to your...
In this case, not so much, in the sense that Okay, so let's take an example of development time. Development time is very important, but what is the development time? The development time is how much time since the coffee began cracking. But let's say you have a 100-gram sample. Let's say there's 1,000 beans in your 100-gram sample. But let's say you have a 15-kilo production roast, which is something like, 150,000 beans or something like that. Your development times are not going to be the same, because when you hear that first or second pop in a sample of 1,000 beans, and when you hear the first or second pop in a very large sample of, say, 150,000 beans, is going to be quite different, because you're going to get a lot more outliers in the large batch. And so it's going to make your development time generally look longer, even for the same amount of development, even for the same total roast time, if that makes sense. Yeah. So they're not the same, right? The development time in a tiny machine with a tiny batch is a very different thing than a production roaster with a very large number of beans in it. Yeah. So things like that can't just be scaled easily. But total roast time and total roast time in general is something that can be scaled if you're very precise about your roast curves and your between batch protocol.
Yeah, interesting. And so are there other markers you might look for apart from the audible first crack? Because I know in a drum roaster you have the ET method of
right
first crack.
Right.
I don't know if you can really do that.
It doesn't really work in the ROEST. It doesn't work in the IMF. We don't have an ET probe in it. It's something that works generally in machines that don't recirculate and have a probe to measure the temperature of the outgoing air from the roasting chamber.
Yeah. So are there any other markers that you have that you are paying attention to if first crack itself is maybe not exactly transferable from one machine to another?
It's not that we don't pay attention to them, but we don't put much weight on them because they're not as reliable or as transferable. So the answer is generally no. Yeah. Okay. I wish it was yes, but no.
Yeah. I mean, we do too. We profile transfer is something we get asked about very, very often. And I would love to say, yes, just
right.
Apply this formula and you will get this result. And maybe someday it will be possible, but I don't think anybody in the whole industry has nailed it yet.
Yeah. I mean, there's such different dynamics in terms of things like what I talked about with the outliers in terms of the crack, things like, okay, how much airflow is there? How much hot metal contact is there? Batch size makes a huge difference with something like that, right? Like in a standard drum roaster, if you have a very large batch, you have a lot less contact with the drum per bean per unit of time. Yeah. So there's so many little factors that shift conduction versus convection, how much airflow, how aggressive is the heat transfer. It's a little bit too difficult with what we know and what we can measure right now to be able to transfer information.
Yeah. So you have a guide, you get some knowledge about coffee.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you have to know your machine, you have to know your coffee.
Yeah.
Good. So we talked a bit about how part of the reason this machine has so many features is that we introduce things in response to users. And it does mean that for somebody who's new to the ROEST, it can be a little intimidating. Right? There's so many buttons to push, there's so many levers to pull, in terms of understanding how to build a profile. Yeah. So, I mean, people would really want to know,
okay,
when you are faced with a brand new coffee, or if you're consulting with a new client who's never used the machine before, how do you go about establishing the first baseline profile?
Right. Okay. So
it's a big question.
This is a little bit analogous to having an iPhone. Okay. Someone from the past could look at an iPhone and be incredibly intimidated because they see you have 300 apps on your phone and they wonder, how do you manage all these? What do you do with all of them? But you don't actually need any of them, right? You could strip it down to telephone calls, texting, web browsing, and Google Maps, and you would have something that's incredibly functional and does 90% of what you want it to do, right? So just because the machine can do an amazing number of things doesn't mean you have to care about all of the features, right? And do you think it's too early to break out the profile creation screen? Okay, so
mine's the way that we.
Okay, here you go. So I'm gonna introduce what I think is a very sensible between batch protocol that will work for everyone for every batch size, and a version of profile creation that I think is pretty close to universal, that it will generally work for almost all situations. The only difference is in terms of like what you need versus the numbers I will put here is that if you're doing smaller batches, your numbers might be lower. If you're doing larger batches, your temperature numbers might be a little bit higher. But that's something that you can figure out pretty easily.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to share the screen of the laptop with you here. Okay, so this is, I think the first thing you need in any roasting system is a sense of your between batch protocol. Because what the between batch protocol does is it cools the machine between batches and it resets the thermal energy of the machine. What this means is all the metal that's involved in the machine, whether you're talking about the drum in a probot, whether you're talking about the metal surrounding the drum in the roost, in any machine, there is some metal. It does have some thermal mass. You want to reset that thermal mass. Even if it's like a Civets air roaster that has just like one big empty chamber, the metal temperature still matters a little bit. And so resetting that metal temperature is step one to having predictable, consistent results. So what I'd like to recommend is that you set up your between batch protocol with the end condition having a drum temperature. Yep. And I personally use 115 degrees Celsius. I find that works with 50 gram batches. I find it works with 200 gram batches. It works great. My goal is to end my roasts with the drum temperature never exceeding 170 Celsius. I find that once it gets to about 175, I can taste a little bit of a difference in the coffee. A little bit of softness goes away, a little bit of harshness might creep in. So it's always good to hedge with lower drum temperatures. So starting at 115 seems low enough to, in almost all situations, be able to keep the end drum temperature below 170. The drum sensor, you can tell me where the drum sensor is in the roost.
Sort of in the midpoint. So it's not the hottest part of the drum, not the coldest, but somewhere in the middle.
Okay. And so it's only measuring the drum temperature in one location. So it's just a proxy. It's not telling you all of the metal temperature, but this proxy is good enough to guide the BBP such that if you use this between batch protocol, you will get very consistent results. That's all that matters. And my air temperature, I've just set to 100 degrees Celsius. You can't see it here. I could show you, but I set the fan to 100% in order to flush air through the roasting chamber as fast as possible. The RPM in this case doesn't matter much. You could set it to 55 or 65. And using this BBP will give you consistent results and a cooler drum with any batch size.
Yeah.
So that's step one. If you use this BBP, you could use it forever for all situations and with pretty good results.
Okay. We get a lot of questions were about charge temperature. And I guess it's a really important point to make is when we talk about charge temperature in the roast, we're talking about a different thing to in a traditional drum roaster, because in basically any other roaster, you have no idea how hot the drum is.
Yep.
So you're guessing, and you're using your charge temperature is an air temperature measurement, and it's a proxy, but your between batch protocol is designed to cool the drum, and you just have to develop a cycle that cools it a reliable amount, but you don't know how much. But here, because we're measuring it, you can keep it much simpler. So how long does your between batch protocol take?
Depending on the batch size, it takes anywhere between 2 and 2.5 minutes. Yeah. So 50 grams, it'll be probably just under 2 minutes. 200 grams, it would probably be about 2:30.
So it's not that long, but you're cooling it a lot. That you're charging relatively cold, which is interesting. But it's because
air has almost no mass.
Yeah.
And using air as your charge temperature guide won't work very well because the metal has a lot of mass, and the metal is going to have a much greater influence over the course of the roast than that starting air temperature. So to me, it's 90 to 10 in terms of importance, the drum temperature versus the air temperature at your charge.
Right.
Okay. So when it comes to creating a profile, this is just one example. I would say this is a pretty reasonable starting point for a 100-gram batch, and you could go slightly hotter, slightly cooler for larger batches and smaller batches, respectively. And so what I've got here is a preheat temp of 180, anything, honestly, again, because the air is so unimportant, anything between 150, 200, totally fine. I've set an end condition development time of 1 minute. Doesn't matter. I'm going to drop manually. I'm not going to let the machine drop it. But let's say I set the end condition as an insurance policy just in case somehow I get distracted and something happens and this doesn't really happen very often, but let's just say I'm away from the machine or something like that. Okay. Just to make sure it doesn't go too dark. And the curve I want to use in this case for 100 grams is inlet temperature versus time. I'm not going to rely on the bean temperature set points in a small batch because they're not quite as reliable as they are in a big batch. And time is fine because I know my BBP works. Yeah. And so I'm just tracking this same inlet temperature curve over time. And you don't need to micromanage your inlet temperature on the roost. The roost will interpolate between any 2 points where you set the inlet temperature. So if my starting inlet temperature is 200 and at 9 minutes I'm at 330, the roost is going to connect those dots using a PID, and I don't have to put 20 set points, which is beautiful. Like I just use 3 set points when I create a profile. I set my peak and I set my end and I set my beginning, and that is it. Yeah. And I let the roost do the rest of the work. I'll set my fan to 100%. This will cause controversy when I say this, but I set the back end fan settings as high as possible, but I don't set the heater fan so high that I lose a little bit of negative pressure. And I set the fan percentage to 100%. And I do this because in an air roaster that can generate whatever inlet temperature you ask of it, higher airflow equals being able to use lower air temperatures to achieve a certain roast time. So this is very different than in a Probot or a Gießen or a Diedrich. This is in the IMF, in the Civets, in the Roost, in machines like that, where you can tell it to give you a certain inlet temperature. Higher airflow means you can use lower temperatures. Lower temperatures mean the drum won't be as hot. So this to me is a positive. I will decrease conduction by using higher airflow. Okay, whatever bit of conduction exists in any of these machines, I want to minimize it. That's why I'm using air roasters. And something like this profile will work, and you just have to go a little bit hotter, a little bit cooler. I would say roast times such as 7-8 minutes are perfectly fine. You can go faster, you can go a little slower. It doesn't matter too much. What matters is check out your drum temperature at the end of the roast. If it's creeping up into the 170s, fix your profile so that it doesn't. And it's not actually such a simple thing, so I don't want to get into that here because we could spend 15 minutes talking about how to minimize that, but that's the goal.
Okay. Yeah. All right. We did have somebody commenting in the chat there. I can see saying that they can't really see the numbers.
On the screen.
Yeah. And I guess this is something that every time you show a curve, people want to copy the.
So the truth is, let's talk about this for a second because this applies to a lot of people. I live at a very high altitude. I live at 1,700 meters. Some people, let's say I know some people using the roost in Colombia are at 2,000 plus meters. Our air is thinner. Our air has less energy carrying capacity in a sense. And so we use even higher temperatures than people at sea level need to use. And these aren't the actual numbers I use because my numbers are whacked compared to everybody else's because I live at such high altitude. So what's really important to understand is that my numbers are not your numbers and somebody else's numbers are probably not your numbers. But you can use that fantastic feature, the adjust all points, and you can raise all of the temperatures by 10, 20, 30, whatever it takes to get you in that 7 to 8 minute range. And then those numbers are going to work for you. And don't worry if your numbers are different than mine or someone else's. That's totally okay. You might have a different heating element. You might be at a different altitude. You might have a different voltage. There might be some, I don't know what factors are going to cause your numbers to be different than mine, but they will be different.
Yeah. Yeah. So the point is, don't get fixated on the numbers, but follow the concept, general idea. Exactly. And what's interesting to me is actually how minimal, how simple this approach is. Mm-hmm. You have a between batch protocol that's just one temperature, wait till the roaster goes. You have a 3-point roast curve, mm-hmm. And you're using this for nearly all of your samples.
Yes, because the fact is that every coffee we get is different. This is a sample roaster, and we are going to put 1,500 different coffees in it this year. And I need something that is versatile, that is going to give me 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 quality every single time. And this is the approach that we've taken to achieve that. Yeah. This is not to say it's optimized for every possible situation. This is just, if this is your starting point, you're already ahead of almost everybody. It's going to work quite well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for people that have been following your books and trying to apply your methods in production roasting, this might be surprising.
Yeah.
Because, when you're production roasting, you're doing a lot of management of the heat.
We can micromanage the heck out of a coffee in a production roaster and replicate that hundreds of times. in the sample roaster, you have to step back and say, what's going to give me the best chance of succeeding with a coffee that I don't know yet?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the last point about this I wanted to come back to is when you first said you use this across a range of different copies, you said you start with the same profile every time.
Mm-hmm.
So then the implication is, are you following the same profile but adjusting the development time? Are you moving into manual at some point? How do you
So yes, the development time is going to change. We're going to do our best to drop at a certain color. Most copies, checking it visually, and I would say that based on experience, let's say a washed Colombian of a certain size, we have a prediction for a development time, whereas let's say an Ethiopian natural, the development time might be minimal. One coffee once was a tiny bean, Ethiopian natural. Our best results were at 0 development time. The coffee was so easy to develop, it was so small that by the time we reached first crack, it was basically done.
If anyone's still hooked on the idea of 20% development being the only...
Right. I mean,
there's your answer to that.
Yes. So something, stepping back 10, 12 years or whatever that was, couple of things. One is that the development time ratio did not exist yet before I wrote the book. The concept didn't exist. And what I saw in my work back then was that people were doing very strange things. People were roasting, some people were doing an old style roast that were 15 plus minutes. Some people were roasting very fast. Some people were roasting extremely dark, extremely light. What can you recommend that's going to take this incredible range around the world, and not just the third wave people, right, but everybody, and say, what's a reasonable target for the average reader? Yeah. And I will stand by that forever as a reasonable target for the average reader, because those who live in this sort of Nordic roast world, hey, I love that coffee too, but that's not what's normal throughout the world. Yeah. And what's normal is quite dark compared to what you and I might enjoy. And if you're going to put a big fat target somewhere for the average roaster, it's not going to be Nordic. We're still the 1%. We're still at the extreme. We're the outlier. And it's important to have that perspective. So, I take a lot of flack from people who are like, but I do this and my coffee's great. And that's not the point. The point is you're not the average roaster or reader. You're an outlier. But when it comes to sample roasting, again, on average, DT is going to be much, much shorter because there are so few outlier beans on both ends of that crack time, such that, your first crack time is going to be quite short compared to a production roaster with 10,000 to 100,000, a million beans in it.
Yeah. Okay. So then I guess the overarching concept then is with like one profile that is safe and choosing the development time to match the coffee, that gets you 90% of the way there, and that's close enough.
Yeah, it's a bit like if I said to you, here's a coffee, you've never seen it before, how are you going to make a V60? You need to start somewhere. Yeah. You'll say, well, okay, I've succeeded with 7 on my AK, I've succeeded with 4 minutes, I use this pattern, I'm going to try that first. Yeah. May not be perfectly optimal for this coffee, but it's a pretty good first try.
Yeah. Okay. So then if people are at home and they're going to build a profile of this kind of general shape, they should be aiming for total roast time of 8 minutes.
7, 8 minutes is great. It's fine.
Terminate based on the color, based on how you like to drink your coffee. Follow this general shape, but adjust the temperatures to how your roaster behaves because it's different. Hopefully that's enough to get people started.
Hopefully.
Okay, so we can stop sharing the screen so we can.
Okay.
If I can move it. Excellent. Okay. So then, the next question was going to be, how do you vary for roasting different coffees? And the answer to that is rarely. But when you do need to, what sort of changes do you end up making for the outliers?
So the first variation is everything will just have its own development time. Yeah. Let's just call it that, based on what we're seeing and hearing and such. And if there's something that's a complete outlier, a very large bean, a very small bean, something with some strange processing that behaves strangely, we'll adjust based on those results. And that's maybe a little bit too much for this conversation because there's too many situations. But I would say if a coffee, again, a tiny bean that flies through the roast, maybe I'll do something to slow it down, right?
Yeah. But the bean size is the number one,
I would say. Bean size and then processing and then moisture content are the 3 biggies in order in terms of how much energy it takes to roast a coffee.
Yeah. Okay. But then when you do make a change, it's really small changes just to ensure that you're hitting the same roughly the same roast time or the same proportionally roast?
I mean, my main goal with sample roasting is get to within a very reasonable color range.
Yeah.
That's number one by far. I mean, if you're not in your color range, it doesn't matter how pretty your curve is, doesn't matter what you did, you've missed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then, you talked a bit about how you don't rely too much on bean temperature data at 100 grams. I think that's completely reasonable. But with the bigger batches, when you get better probe coverage and the BT data does become reliable, how does your approach change?
I'll use the inlet temperature, bean temperature profiling. I'll do a pretty similar curve in terms of setting up 3 points. And that peak of the inlet temperature is usually about 5 degrees bean temperature before first crack begins. So I'll usually peak, let's say if my first crack is 190, I'll peak at about 185, and then I'll have the inlet temperature begin to drop from there.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. And then if you roast a coffee on a fairly simple curve like that, and you find that it still is looking, you're still seeing a crash around first crack, how do you then adjust from there?
It depends. So usually our sample roasts, when it comes to crashes, my biggest concern about a crash is, let's say you're a sort of a medium roaster. If you have a crash, you're effectively going to have no choice but to flick your way out of the crash to get to the end of your roast where you get to the color you want. That can be quite damaging to flavor, especially in a drum roaster, a little bit less so in the roost, a little bit less so in, let's say, our IMF. In a sample roast, we're generally roasting so light that we're never getting to that point anyway. So even if there's a crash, we're effectively dropping by about the end of the crash. So we're not terribly concerned about that in this case.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about BBP. We talked about scaling to the bigger roasters. So then the next question, this is something we get asked about quite a lot. And this is about tipping. So this is something that it seems to me that air roasters are particularly prone to tipping. But okay, I can tell straight away that this is something that I hear people say, and so I'm just wondering, what's your approach? Do you think it's something that's important? Is it something you watch out for? How do you minimize it?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly matters in the sense that if you're getting tipping, it's a symptom of something going wrong. You're getting too much conduction, too much contact with the drum, that kind of thing. I'm pretty sure if you stick to the 7 to 8 minutes and keep your drum temperature below 170, you're not going to see much tipping. Certainly a very, very soft bean might be prone to it, even under very careful, delicate roasting conditions.
Yeah.
The only answer in situation like that is to roast extremely slow so that all metal surfaces are cooler.
Yeah. So keep the temperatures low.
Yeah.
And that's why then you keep the airflow high so that you can have good heat transfer without going too hot.
Yeah. I mean, you could say in situations like that or with a drum roaster, the general answer is slower is safer, because slower means all surfaces are cooler.
Yeah. I just want to check, are we having some audio problems, or is everything okay? Because I can see Joe's checking some things in the audio. Can you guys let us know in the chat if you're having trouble hearing us, or if everything is
Can't really hear.
Oh, it's choppy. Okay, maybe it's connection based. Okay, I will say that we are recording this, so if you aren't able to hear us, hopefully the recording at least will make that, will salvage that. Joe's still working on in the background.
Goes silent for parts connection.
Okay.
Yeah, mine's good too.
Yeah.
Solid, yeah.
Okay. We're going to do what we can, but yeah, we will. Hopefully, we can salvage it from the recording. I think for now, best if we continue. And, yeah, we'll keep going. Okay. So then, just a couple of more general questions. So one that a couple of people asked is about how you actually get access to the really good, interesting coffees, especially if you're a small roaster, you're just starting out. Because a lot of people get this as their first machine. How do you get the good stuff?
It's absolutely the hardest part of being a roaster is forging those relationships. There's a lot of producers who do wonderful things who are basically booked out for a year or more because they already have pre-sold their production to regular clients. There is no easy answer there. And yeah, it's super hard. And if I knew the answer, I may not necessarily tell everybody because it's so hard. No, but really, it's something that everyone struggles with.
Yeah. Okay, so you're not alone.
No.
That's what we can give you. So then for roasters of that kind, for your clients who are small scale roasteries, or for people that are just getting into the roasting business, what do you think are the big challenges that are coming up? What should people be preparing for now that will be different?
That'll be different.
Yes.
Oh, I try not to predict the future.
Or the same challenges.
Honestly, I think the only person I know who's good at predicting the future is James Hoffman. I have no idea what's coming next. I will say whatever it is, it's not what we think it is. But because most of the
What James thinks it is.
Yeah, well, basically yes. But usually the problems that we are aware of are things that we're actually actively working on fixing. It's the problems that we encounter are usually the ones we didn't see coming because we weren't prepared for them.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we all know that, let's say, climate change is affecting green production. We see a lot of parts of the world where rainfall patterns are not what they used to be, and it's really messing with both quality and quantity. But how that plays out is anyone's guess. Certainly, it's challenging throughout the chain. I just I have faith that in the very long run, that human innovation is such that we will find pretty good solutions for most of these problems, but it's never instantaneous. Yeah. And there'll always be a period of rough times where things don't go well, and then someone comes up with a solution. And the solution might be processing related. The solution might be, who knows, right? But it's, that's not, my job is teaching copy roasting.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to give a bit of time to questions that have come in from the live. And the first question is actually about the warm-up protocol. How is that any different to how you approach BBP? How long do you heat the roaster for?
Right. So what we do is we have a curve that looks a little bit like our roasting curves, but it's just a little bit hotter. And we simply set it up so that after about 9 or 10 minutes, the drum temperature reading is about 170 or 175, I forget the number, and then we trigger our between batch protocol, and then we after that go into our first batch.
So it's essentially just a dummy roast.
Yep. But it's based on drum temperature ultimately in terms of what makes us finish our warm up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And actually, the person who asked this question was asking if we are planning to introduce an automatic warm up protocol. This is something a couple of people have asked. I won't say that we won't, or that it's impossible, but it is very easy to.
The thing is, let's say the warm up you might want for a 50 gram batch is different than a 200, and you don't necessarily know your user's needs. But it's actually not difficult to create your own warm up profile. Have an increasing inlet temperature profile and stop it at effectively the drum temperature you usually end your roast at, maybe plus 5 degrees. Above that, and if as long as it doesn't happen too fast, as long as it takes 9, 10, 11 minutes, you'll be good. If you don't mind, I'm going to address one thing because I meant to earlier. Someone asked about the first crack sensitivity. We tend to set it to a maximum plus 10, and we tend to set it that the machine will auto mark first crack after it hears 2 cracks. That's our choice. I'm not saying that's the only way to do it.
Absolutely, as early as possible.
Yeah, but that's our choice. But I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but I think it's a good question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, for me, I would say the sensitivity setting does vary a little bit by machine. Yeah. So plus 10 is working for Scott.
Yeah.
But in your own case, if you set it to plus 10 on your own machine, you might find that it starts marking cracks that are not cracks.
Yeah.
You have to use your judgment a little bit there.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Just from a technical point of view, if you hear cracks and the machine doesn't, then increase.
yes.
But if you put the sensitivity up to 10 and you start seeing cracks that are 110 degrees, those aren't cracks.
Yeah. Probably. Yeah. So
unless it sounds like a crack.
You set your threshold 5 degrees below what you think is the lowest possible temperature it should crack at, and then hopefully you prevent too many of those phantom cracks from auto marking it. Yeah.
Okay. But so adjust according to your machine. But great. Now another question, I'm not sure how much we can get into this, but quite a few of our users, if they bought a machine before we introduced the inlet, or if they bought the S100, they don't have the inlet temperature probe.
Okay.
First thing I want to say is, if that is you, if you don't have an inlet temperature probe, you can upgrade your machine. It is it's not challenging. I'm not an engineer, and I can install those sensors. So if you have a machine already, you can upgrade to inlet. It is something you can do yourself. You don't need to send the machine back to us. You don't need an engineer. So definitely encourage you to upgrade. But if for whatever reason you can't, or you don't have one right now, what would you recommend?
Okay. So if you have a successful between batch protocol that really does reset the machine's thermal energy properly, you can be extremely consistent using something like a power profile. The two things you need are, one, a good BBP, and two, the ambient conditions can't vary by more than, let's say, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, right? That's not that hard for most people. So that's the alternative. The inlet is just a little bit more insurance in case ambient conditions have changed a lot or something like that. But there's no reason you can't succeed with a power profile.
Yeah, and a power profile for most people that are roasting should be fairly intuitive because that's much more similar to a gas setting.
Yes, except that it's important to understand that in let's say a Probot type machine, you're storing a lot of the energy from the burner into the drum as you begin a roast. And then late in the roast, the drum might be releasing some of that energy. And so it's going to be a little bit different in the roost. It's not going to be starting with really high energy and just tapering off the whole time. It might look a little bit more pyramid-like in your power settings.
Yeah.
So, but just keep that in mind that it's not a Probot, it's not a Gayson, it's not a Diedrich. It's a whole other animal, and your power setting trends are going to be a little different.
Yeah. Okay. And one person here has asked what percentage of the capacity is optimal in sample roasters. The question is phrased kind of generally, but to start with, talking about the roast, like what do you think are the sweet spots in terms of batch size?
I think in terms of coffee quality, 200 grams is absolutely the best batch size.
Mm-hmm.
And this has a lot to do with conduction and amount of time of drum contact per bean per unit of time. So, and this applies to most drum roasters, that larger batches tend to have a little bit less contact. Yeah. Other sample roasters, it's completely up to the design of the machine, of course.
Yeah. And I think if you're in a production roaster, like if you're using the absolute full advertised capacity, that's not always a good idea.
Not always, no.
But, larger up to the point where the burner has enough power.
Mm-hmm.
200 grams quality-wise is ideal.
Yeah.
But for most people, 100 grams is the sample they have to work with.
Right.
What about 50-gram batches? How do you approach?
Very similar approach, just lower temperatures. 50 gram can work quite well, especially because you get to use much lower temperatures, so things stay cooler. So it's not a problem. I actually prefer 200 grams the most, and then 50 grams, and then 100 grams in terms of quality results.
Yeah. Okay. Are we still getting questions in? Because I'm not seeing them.
I see a question from Luca at the end there.
With respect to sample size, we probably would yield at least 70 grams roasted coffee. So that we do 5 bowls. Yeah, that makes sense. So that means
100 grams plus.
50 gram batch is limiting. Yes, of course. I know some suppliers have got in the habit of sending 50 grams unless you request 100 grams.
Yeah.
So that might depend a bit.
We always offer to pay. We always offer to pay for samples directly from warehouse, like they go to, say, in the US, Continental or Annex, or here, Hamburg, Antwerp. We always offer to pay that because they incur some expenses when they ask a warehouse to take samples, and we also offer to pay extra for 200 grams because we want the sample material, because we want the greatest chance to buy the coffee. Some accept that, some say don't worry about it, but I like to be sensitive to the fact that samples cost money to suppliers.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I know I've been guilty of this. You get excited, you buy way more samples than you actually have time to roast and to cup, and that's actually a big drain on companies, and the companies that provide you the interesting coffees. If you're trying to get hold of the good stuff, you're working with companies that have high margins, that have that where that cost has an impact on the business, for sure. Yeah. Okay, if people have more questions, now is your chance. How do you compensate for change in pressure when the fan gets dirty? This is actually a good question, because we encourage you to keep your fans clean, but however often you do your maintenance, you do see a change in airflow over time, kind of in between cleanings. Do you make any adjustments for that, or do you just clean more?
Just clean more often. Yeah. That's the best answer. And I'm not terribly worried because, again, we're not doing 100 production roasts in a row of the same coffee. We're worried more about just hitting certain targets and getting a quality sample roast. So we don't have to worry about whether today's roasts are behaving identically to 2 months ago. But you're the expert in what one should do to maintain the fan and how often.
Yeah. I mean, you can't clean too often, put it that way. And the more often you do it, cleaning is one of those things that the daily cleaning is fine. It takes less than a minute. That's not a problem. But the deep cleaning, it's a job. Opening up the roaster, it takes a bit of time. You have to set aside time to do it. So it's very easy to push that to the back of the priority list. But the longer you leave it, the harder it is. And if you find this a difficult job, you should do it more often, not less. If it takes time, if it's slowing you down, if it's something that you're dreading doing, the longer you leave it, the worse it's going to be. So clean often, clean early. That's all I will say about that. Okay. Okay. So then, and somebody's asking how the practice of fiction helps you. So this is actually I think quite a fair question, because if you are choosing to end every roast manually, as you are when you're sample roasting, how much are you actually using the first crack detection data? Are there things you use it for, or would you be just as happy marking manually?
I'd be just as happy marking manually, but I tend to multitask while I'm sample roasting. I tend to be measuring color, weighing out beans.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say this, but I usually write emails while I'm sample roasting. And making sure that I never miss first crack so that I have a sense of the development time it's very handy.
Yeah.
Usually my manual mark and the automatic mark are basically identical, but sometimes the machine catches it before I do. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a key point, is you can get just as good results by marking it manually, but it means you have to be fully concentrated. And the whole reason we started building this machine in the first place was to free people up from standing in front of the machine with the spoon. Yeah. In your ways. Yep. So yeah. Okay. So let me see. We have a few. So there's a couple of questions about that are specific about profiles, like how do you deal with a natural if it crashes after first crack? And I think the point of these is it's very hard to give specific recommendations about a specific curve, about a specific movie without looking at the curve. So for that kind of question, it's not something that's easily answered in this kind of format.
But I will say, naturals don't really crash. So if you're seeing that, you're probably seeing fake data. It's probably that the batch size is too small for the probe position, and the probe is probably getting more a read of cooler moisture coming off the beans and less of the actual bean surfaces, because naturals basically don't crash. And so that, keep that in mind. It's one of those like frustrating concepts of like, yeah, but what am I supposed to do if I don't trust the data, that kind of thing. But that's just, that's part of the game with all sample roasters. But the bigger problem with naturals is that if you apply too much heat, they'll sort of run away from you more easily than washed coffees would, and you might end up with an extremely short DT, which may not be okay, or you might sort of have so much momentum at the end of the roast, you realize what's happening, you drop the coffee, but it carries on a little bit more than you like it to.
Yeah. Okay. And then Robert is asking, how long after roasting, or how soon after roasting can you cup?
You can cup right away if you wish. I think it takes a little practice to interpret those results. I don't think it's a problem. I would say we do most of our cupping the day after sample roasting. We often come back to sample roasts over 4 or 5 or 6 days to see if something is changing. But there's a tension in coffee between, sure, it'd be really nice to wait a week to see if the coffee tastes different, tastes optimal. But when it comes to buying green, the better green generally disappears quite quickly, and you want to make a decision rapidly. So we'll often sample roast, cup, and try to make a buying decision that day if possible. Because like the truly amazing coffees or great values, like they don't last very long. So Is it optimal? No. But what's the best business decision? That's up to you.
Yeah. Okay. And then for flavor point of view, if you're just roasting coffee to taste, like out of the roast, how long would you leave it ideally?
It really depends on how light or dark you roast. Really light roasts might take many days or weeks to open up, and darker roasts might taste pretty good, close to optimal within a couple of days. It really, really depends.
Yeah. I think for some people, hearing weeks plural might already be surprising.
Oh, I mean, someone wrote me on Instagram yesterday and said, "Oh, I just found this Ethiopia from you from a year and a half ago, and it still tastes great." And it wasn't in their freezer; it was just in a cupboard somewhere. Really light roasts. Yeah. Really light roasts age very slowly and sometimes improve for many months.
Yeah. Okay. And then somebody asked average time for a roast. Now we did address this earlier, so I'll just quickly say 100 gram roast. We were saying 7 to 8 minutes is pretty.
But I don't think it's very important. You're not going to find that you can't get good results at 7 minutes or 10 minutes or 12 minutes. You can get good results at any of those. You just obviously for efficiency purposes with sample roasting, if you can get a good result at 7, 8, you'd rather do that instead of 12.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Adam's asking in the going back to the example profile that we discussed at the beginning. The question is actually what's the rationale for having the peak at 9 minutes? But I think actually what the point it really is, what the real question here is, where in your roast progression should the peak
in this case, the inlet temperature never drops because we're usually finishing around 7.5, 8 minutes. Okay. The truth is, Adam, if I have a very, very hard to develop, with most coffees, this works perfectly fine. If I have a very hard to develop coffee, let's say I'm looking at a Pacamara or something extremely large, I might manually begin to lower the inlet just before first crack begins as a way of stretching the development time a little bit extra, and to sort of guarantee that the heat that I plowed into the beans by first crack has time to actually reach the center of the beans.
Yeah. Okay. I think we are at the end of our time, so we're going to draw a line under the question there. If you have had any trouble hearing this, I'm really sorry about the audio problems, but as I said, we have been recording. Hopefully we will be able to post a version of this that will be a little bit easier to follow, as long as the microphones are picking it up. So yeah, if this has been a struggle to follow along, I'm sorry about that, but I want to say thank you so much for joining us, and a huge thank you for Scott, who flew into Oslo yesterday and is flying back out tomorrow. So he's having with us is a huge privilege, and